I've always been captivated by churches, not for the faith they harbor, but for the tranquility and enigma they exude. For years, I've explored old, abandoned churches, capturing their essence in photographs and pocketing small tokens. However, one of these expeditions would leave an indelible mark on my life. It was a rainy afternoon when I discovered an old church perched on a hill, surrounded by overgrowth. It looked like a scene from a horror movie. The main door was slightly open, beckoning me to enter. Inside, it was dark and damp, with a scent of decay hanging in the air. I flicked on my flashlight and began to explore, taking photos of the architectural details and remnants of long-lost rituals. That's when I found a rosary on the ground near the altar. It was ancient, with worn wooden beads and a silver cross tarnished by time. I felt an inexplicable pull towards it, as if it was calling out to me. Without a second thought, I picked it up and placed it in my pocket. Back in my apartment, I placed the rosary on my nightstand and retired for the night, feeling content with my find. But my peace was short-lived. As soon as I closed my eyes, I was besieged by nightmares, grotesque images of twisted bodies and mangled faces. I woke up several times, drenched in sweat and with my heart pounding. The following nights brought no respite. The nightmares grew more vivid and terrifying. I began to notice strange marks on my body, scratches, bruises, and cuts that I couldn't explain. Sometimes, I felt a weight on my chest, as if someone was sitting on me, making it hard to breathe. One night, a sharp pain in my arm made me turn on the light, revealing a series of fresh scratches that seemed to appear before my eyes. I looked at the rosary on my nightstand, its silver cross gleaming in the darkness, and a wave of panic washed over me. Could it be that the rosary was cursed? I decided to investigate its origins, returning to the church where I found it, hoping to uncover some about its history. I searched local archives and spoke with town elders, who told me stories of past priests and tragic events that had occurred within those sacred walls. One tale stood out. Decades ago, a man was murdered in that church, and his vengeful spirit cursed any intruder who dared desecrate the church. The thought that the rosary might be linked to that curse sent a chill down my spine. I decided to get rid of the rosary, hoping the paranormal phenomena would cease. I drove to a nearby lake and threw it into the water, feeling a strange relief as I watched it sink into the depths. That night, I slept without nightmares for the first time in weeks. The marks on my body began to heal, but my reprieve was short-lived. A few days later, I heard a noise coming from my room. There, on my bed, lay the rosary, soaked and covered in algae. An icy dread ran down my spine. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The lights flickered, and the room's temperature dropped. Suddenly, I felt an invisible force push me against the wall, an unbearable pressure crushing my chest. Dark figures approached, their eyes gleaming with malice as they whispered in an unknown tongue. Though I didn't understand the words, I felt their hatred and fury. Remembering the villagers' stories about the cursed priest, I decided to pray for forgiveness. I had never been a religious person, but at that moment, I had no other choice. With all my strength, I began to pray, asking for forgiveness for my arrogance and sins. As I prayed, the dark figures stopped, and the pressure on my chest eased. I felt a cold, ghostly hand caress my cheek, and a soft voice whispered in my ear, "Your regret is sincere. Now find peace." The room filled with a bright, warm light, and the figures disappeared. The rosary, now clean and shiny, rested at my feet. Since that day, I have not experienced any more paranormal phenomena. I kept the rosary as a reminder of the lesson I learned. There are forces in this world that we cannot understand, and we must respect them. Though I will never return to my old, skeptical, and arrogant ways, I now find a new perspective on life and faith every time I pass a church. I stop for a moment to offer a prayer of thanks, and while I continue to explore ancient and mysterious places, I do so with a newfound sense of respect and humility. Moving to a new house is always a mix of emotions. A new beginning, but also a feeling of insertion. When I found that old house on the outskirts of the city, near a cemetery and a church, I was attracted by its rustic charm and its affordable price. It seemed the perfect opportunity to start again. After several years of ups and downs, I never thought that decision would mark the beginning of the most terrifying experience of my life. From the first day, the house had a strange atmosphere. The stone walls and high ceilings gave it a cold and gloomy air, but I attributed it to its age. While unpacking my things, I noticed that the house had many cracks and a constant creak, but I ignored it, thinking it was normal for a construction of that age. The first night, the wind blew outside, making the windows vibrate. It was difficult for me to sleep with all those noises, but finally, I managed to fall asleep. Then, I had the first strange dream. I was walking through the cemetery among the tombstones covered in moss, and I felt that someone was watching me. I woke up sweating and with a feeling of restlessness that I couldn't shake. The following days were relatively normal. However, each time I passed through the cemetery, I felt a chill running down my spine. One afternoon, while tidying up the garden, I saw a figure standing among the tombstones. It was an old-looking man dressed in shabby and dirty clothes. At first, I thought he was some homeless man, but when I blinked, he had disappeared. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but the visions continued. One night, while reading in the living room, I heard a whisper. When I looked up, I saw a woman standing in the corner of the room. Her skin was pale, and her eyes were empty, filled with indescribable pain. When I tried to move, it disappeared as if it had never been there. I was sure it couldn't have been real, but the terror I felt was too tangible. I decided to investigate the history of the cemetery and the church. I discovered that many of those buried there had died in tragic circumstances. Epidemics, accidents, even a fire that had destroyed part of the town decades ago. Each story was darker than the last. I began to think that perhaps those souls were not at peace and somehow trying to communicate with me. One night, while I was trying to sleep, I clearly heard the sound of a woman crying coming from the cemetery. I gathered my courage and left the house. I walked to the entrance of the cemetery, my flashlight trembling in my hand. When I arrived, I saw the silhouette of a woman kneeling in front of a grave, sobbing uncontrollably. When I approached, she looked up, her eyes of pain met mine, and I felt a wave of sadness so intense that it made me retreat. "What do you want?" I managed to whisper, my voice just a thread. The figure vanished, leaving only an echo of her crying in the air. That night, I could barely sleep. The images of the woman and the other figures that I had seen tormented me. I began to have nightmares every night, seeing the people buried in the cemetery reliving their last moments. I felt their despair, their pain, their fear. The nights became a constant torture, and during the day, I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, hoping to see some spectral figure. I decided to seek help and went to the church to speak to the priest, an elderly and understanding man. I told him everything I had experienced, hoping he would have some explanation or solution. He listened to me patiently and then told me that the cemetery had a long history of tragedies. Many of those buried there had not received the proper rituals, and their souls were trapped, seeking rest. "You should pray for them," he told me. "Ask them to find the peace that they did not have in life." Although I was skeptical, I decided to follow his advice. Every night, I lit a candle and prayed for the souls of the deceased. At first, there did not seem to be any change. The visions and nightmares continued, but after a week, I noticed a slight improvement. The figures were less frequent, and when they appeared, they seemed less distressed. However, one night I had a different vision. I saw the young priest, the same one who had been with me in my previous dreams. He was standing in front of the church, his face full of anguish. I approached him, and this time, instead of disappearing, he began to speak. His voice was just a whisper, but I could understand it. "It was me who started the fire," he said. "It was me who caused all those deaths." I felt a knot in my stomach. The priest had been the cause of the tragedy, and his soul was trapped with remorse and guilt. He looked at me with pleading eyes. "Please help me find forgiveness." I woke up startled, with my heart racing. That morning, I went to the church and spoke again with the old priest. I told him about my vision, and his eyes were filled with sadness. "That is a story that few know," he said. "The young priest who caused the fire died in the same spirit. He has been here ever since, seeking redemption. I decided I had to do something. I gathered some friends, and we organized a ceremony in the cemetery. We prayed for all the souls who had suffered, asking them to find peace. I felt a strange calm, as if a burden had been lifted from my shoulders. That night, I slept without nightmares for the first time in months. The visions stopped, and the atmosphere in the house became lighter. But the experience left a mark on me. I learned that there are forces in this world that we do not fully understand, and that suffering can last far beyond death. The house still stands, and the cemetery is still there, a silent reminder of the tragedies of the past. But now, I feel that those spirits have finally found the peace they were looking for. I've always been a skeptic, not one to believe in things I cannot see or touch. My friends knew this about me, and that's why they made their bet one summer night as we sat around a bonfire sharing horror stories. The conversation turned to the old, abandoned church on the outskirts of town, said to be haunted. One friend, his eyes reflecting the firelight, said no one dared enter at night. Another added that if I wasn't afraid, I should give it a try. I rolled my eyes and accepted the challenge. Spend an hour in the church, and if I came out unscathed, I'd win some money. That night, my rationality was tested in ways I never imagined. The church stood imposing against the night sky, its ivy-covered stone walls and ruined bell tower casting dark shadows. A slight chill ran down my spine, which I attributed to the cool night breeze. Armed with a flashlight, I approached the slightly open main door, which creaked as I entered. Inside, the church was plunged into shadows, with disorderly benches and an altar covered in dust. Religious images watched me with empty eyes. Crucifixes, statues of saints, and virgins, all mute witnesses to my dare. I began to mock the images, making sarcastic comments about faith and those who believe in these inanimate figures. At first, it was fun, a way to relieve the tension of being alone in that dark, desolate place. But then, the temperature in the church seemed to drop abruptly, and the lantern began to flicker. Suddenly, it went out, plunging me into total darkness. That's when I heard the first sound, a soft, barely audible whisper that seemed to come from all directions. I shouted, trying to sound brave, but there was no response, only more whispers. Panic began to take over as I tried to leave, but the door I had entered through was now closed. Suddenly, a figure appeared before me, a shadow darker than darkness itself, floating and moving slowly towards me. My heart pounded, and a cold sweat soaked my forehead. I stumbled back over the pews and fell to the ground. The figure stopped, and then a deep, resonant voice filled the church, asking why I profaned that sacred place. I tried to respond, but my words choked in my throat. The figure vanished, and suddenly the flashlight came back on. I hurriedly got up and ran towards the door, which was now open, leaving the church without looking back. I thought I had left everything behind, but I was wrong. That same night, paranormal phenomena began in my house. Lights turning on and off by themselves, objects moving, and a constant feeling of a presence. The voices I had heard in the church now whispered in my ears, even when I was alone. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, and despair began to consume my mind. After several nights without rest, I understood that I needed to do something. I remembered the words of the figure in the church and knew that I had to return. With my heart in my fist, I returned to the abandoned church, hoping to find a way to stop the nightmare that my life had become. I entered carefully, feeling that the eyes of the statues followed my every movement. I knelt before the altar, something I had never done before, and began to ask for forgiveness. I didn't know if anyone was listening, but I poured out my heart, confessing my skepticism and arrogance, promising to respect the faith and not make fun of it anymore. As I prayed, a bright light began to fill the church, wrapping myself in a warm and comforting glow. I felt a peace that I had never experienced before, as if all my worries faded away. The light blinded me, and before I lost consciousness, I heard a soft voice say, "Your regret is sincere. Now find peace." I woke up at dawn, lying on the floor of the church. I felt different, lighter. The voices had disappeared, and the church was silent as if nothing had happened. I left there knowing that my life had changed forever. Since that day, I became a believer. I don't know exactly what happened that night. The experience taught me that faith is not just about believing in what we see, but accepting that there are mysteries in the world that we cannot explain. And although I don't have all the answers, I found a peace that I had never known before. Now, when I pass by the abandoned church, I offer a silent prayer, grateful for the second opportunity that was given to me. The confessional has been one of my passions, a way to disconnect from the routine and explore new places. On one of those trips, I decided to visit a small town in the middle of nowhere. The road was narrow and winding, surrounded by thick forests that gave it a mysterious and almost disturbing air. I arrived at the town at dusk, just as the sun began to hide behind the mountains, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple. The town was picturesque with houses of red roofs and cobblestone streets. The people seemed friendly, but there was a feeling of melancholy in the air that I couldn't ignore. After a day of exploring, I realized that I hadn't booked accommodation, and the few hostels in the town were full due to a festival. Desperate to find a place to rest, I headed to the town church, an old structure with colorful stained glass windows and a bell tower that rose towards the sky. I decided to enter in the hope of finding a quiet corner where I could sleep for a few hours. The main door was half open, and upon entering, fresh and slightly humid air enveloped me, giving me a shiver. The interior of the church was impressive. The candle lights flickered softly, creating dancing shadows on the walls. The smell of incense was strong but pleasant. I walked down the central aisle, observing the empty benches and the altar decorated with flowers and candles in the background. I noticed the confessional seemed like the perfect place to hide and rest without being disturbed. I approached the confessional and opened the small wooden door. The interior was narrow, with barely any space to sit. I settled down the best I could and closed the door behind me, feeling a strange sense of security. The silence was absolute, only broken by the occasional creak of the aged wood. Tiredness quickly overcame me, and I began to fall asleep. However, just as I was about to succumb to sleep, I heard a whisper. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but the whisper became clearer. It was a soft and distressed female voice saying, "Father, I have sinned." My heart skipped a beat. There was someone else in the church. I stayed silent, listening as the voice continued, detailing confessions of horrible acts, betrayals, murders, and despair. I felt a chill run through my body. I tried to open the door of the confessional to go out and face whoever was speaking, but the door did not move. Trapped and desperate, I pushed harder, but it was in vain. Suddenly, another voice joined the first one. This time, it was a deep male voice full of remorse, saying, "Father, I cannot find peace. My hands are stained with the blood of the innocent." The anguish in his voice was palpable, and the air inside the confessional became thick and oppressive. I began to feel panic. I tried to scream, but my voice choked in my throat. That's when I felt pressure on my shoulders, as if invisible hands were holding me. I tried to get away, but the pressure only increased, immobilizing me. The voices continued, one after another, disturbing confessions from people who had clearly deceased. I felt a wave of terror and despair, wondering why I couldn't get out. I vaguely remembered what I had been taught about praying in times of despair. Although I was never a religious person, I closed my eyes tightly and began to murmur a prayer, asking for forgiveness for any sin that I had committed. As I prayed, the voices became softer, as if they were fading. The pressure on my shoulders slowly decreased, and finally, the door to the confessional creaked open. I staggered out of the church. It was silent as if nothing had happened. The candles were still flickering softly, and the incense filled the air. I looked around, feeling a mix of relief and confusion. There was no sign of the people who had made the confessions. I walked to the altar, still shaking, and knelt, grateful to have escaped. Even though I didn't fully understand what had happened, I knew I would never see a church the same way again. The next day, I left the town as soon as dawn came. As I drove along the winding road, I couldn't stop thinking about the experience. The confessions, the voices, and the feeling of invisible hands were still chasing me. I decided not to tell anyone what had happened, fearing they would take me for crazy. As the days turned into weeks, I tried to put the incident behind me and move on with my life. But the nights were difficult. I often woke up in a cold sweat, with the feeling that someone was watching me. The images of the people who had confessed continued to appear in my dreams, their faces full of anguish and despair. I decided to investigate more about the church and its history. I discovered that it had been the scene of many tragedies throughout the ages: fires, suicides, and mysterious disappearances. The people of the town avoided talking about the dark past of the church, but it was clear that something sinister had happened there. One day, I met an elder of the town who seemed to know more than he was willing to share. He told me that many years ago, the priest who led the church had been found dead in the confessional, his face frozen in an expression of terror. Since then, it was said that the souls of sinners returned to confess their crimes, seeking redemption. The story left me with more questions than answers. I had witnessed those confessions. Why had I been chosen to hear them? I had no answers, but I knew I could never forget what I had experienced. Over time, I learned to live with the memory of that night. Although the fear never completely disappeared, I found a way to move on. I decided that although I could not change what had happened, I could honor the memory of those who had suffered. I began to visit churches on my travels, not to hide, but to pray for those whose souls were still searching for peace. The experience changed me deeply. Life continued, and with it, a new understanding of how fragile and precious our existence is. Each day is an opportunity to live with purpose and compassion, remembering that even in the darkest places, there can be a ray of hope. My childhood was not the best. My parents were quite poor and managed to survive amidst the illnesses and misery of those difficult times. I have a vague memory that when I was just over 4 years old, a nun named Sister Asunción often visited us. She belonged to an orphanage in a nearby town and wanted to make sure that we lived well and that my parents were capable of taking care of me and my siblings. Time passed, and one day the nun did not return. I never knew what became of her, and my parents never mentioned it, at least not in front of me and my siblings. Now I'm 10 years old, and my siblings are 7, and I'm the oldest. One day, I was playing marbles with my little brothers outside the house when I felt like something was watching me. It was like when you are next to a person and you know that that person is there. I had the strange feeling that there was someone staring at the place where we were. I looked everywhere and didn't see anyone, not even the neighbor's dog that usually stays. Suddenly, I noticed that something moved between some bushes, and I saw it was Sister Asunción with her gaze fixed on us, apparently having returned to mortify my parents with the idea that he was going to take his children away from him because they were not capable of guaranteeing their future. But now, he was no longer in front of him, and he was watching over us. I walked in the direction of where she was and asked her what she was doing, but she didn't answer. As I approached, I could feel a heat and a strange smell that made me stop and cover my nose. When I did, I lowered my eyes for a few seconds, and then when I looked again, she was no longer there. I ran to see where she had gone, but it was just for fun. There was not even a hint left to prove that she was there. I never told my mother about that episode. Now I know that I should have done it, but at that moment, I didn't want to worry her because it was enough for her to manage every day to be able to feed us. After that, many mysterious things happened in our house. Things moved or changed places, shadows that crossed from one room to another during the night, and there was also that rotten smell that was felt despite all the flavorings that my mother used to try to eliminate it. I remember one time my brother, 2 years younger than me, was sleeping, and I saw how something approached him. From the darkness of the corner of the room, I thought it was my imagination, but when I turned to look towards the window, she was there again. It was Sister Asunción behind the window, looking at us in total silence. At that point, I was already terrified of that nun, and every time I saw her passing somewhere, my nerves collapsed. By then, I had no idea what was happening, but it seemed that inside my childish mind, I suspected that something dark was hidden behind that nun's habit. One afternoon, I went to have tea with my mother and my Aunt Guillermina, who was one of those very superstitious women with some beliefs deeply rooted in the paranormal field. My mother told her everything mysterious that was happening, and she told her that from what she told her, it seemed that some unexpected visitor had moved into her house. I, who was nearby, told her about the constant harassment of the nun for years. The three of us, until that moment, did not know the dark and horrendous part of the story. But when my mother and my aunt heard me say that Sister Asunción was hiding to keep watch, they were stunned. "Are you sure you saw Sister Asunción, son?" Confused with Sister Teresa, that good nun we saw in the parish last Sunday, Mom asked me, but I told her no. I was sure she was Sister Asunción, and I didn't understand how a nun her age could climb up to our window room to spy on us. My mother was frozen, paralyzed with fear because she had finally understood everything. That same afternoon, she went to the orphanage to ask about Sister Asunción to corroborate the information that she already had. Certainly, Sister Asunción had died a few years ago since the times in that she visited our house, and that is why she stopped doing so. Another thing that the Mother Superior told her left her even colder. She told her that information had reached her ears that some of the residents claimed to have seen the ghost of Sister Asunción walking through the streets of the town. But it wasn't her. The souls in purgatory were adopting her image to be able to get into homes and torment the children. I remember that my mother returned home that day. She took her things, packed ours, and we left that town to never return again. "It's time to close, daughter. You must leave the church," I told the girl daily. She begged for a little more time to continue with her prayers, but I woke up startled. That recurring nightmare would not let me forget that sad story. I felt Carmen's ghost in every corner, in every image of the church, especially in the third pew on the right row where she always sat to pray. Carmen was a girl from a town near Oaxaca. She had many days without sleep or sleeping very badly, and the figure of that woman appeared every night, snatching her from a town near the city of Oaxaca. Carmen said that when she was an adult, she wanted to devote herself to God, and her greatest desire was to become a nun. She lived with her mother in a somewhat separated house in precarious conditions because they were very poor. Her father left one day to work on a coffee farm and never returned. He was assaulted and killed when he came back home to steal from him. Others said he left with another woman. The truth is that he never returned, and Carmen's mother had to raise her as best she could, plunged into the crudest of miseries. One day, a landowner moved to the town after buying some lands very close to where the girl lived. And when he saw her, he was surprised at her beauty and could not stop seeing her with dark intentions. He only thought about taking her to his bed, and as rich as he was, he had no intention of giving up his designs, although he knew about the girl's wishes to become a servant of God. He spent a lot of time trying to court Carmen with expensive gifts, but she always rejected them because she always made her know her decision to consecrate her life to God. Carmen always complained that she felt her presence everywhere and that he caused her a lot of fear. And the girl was right to worry because that man was very dangerous. A cowboy, when he was about to milk his cows, found Carmen's body lifeless on the grass of the road. The news spread like wildfire and reached every corner of that town. Armed settlers went to look for the suitor, Don Ramiro, but they never found him after committing that horrifying crime. He left the people, and from that night in the town, strange and terrifying things began to happen. The dwellers said they saw shadows that crossed the street in the early hours and hid in the alleys when the night fell, and it was practically forbidden to repent. The parish was not exempt from those events. I remember that one afternoon when I was about to close the parish, I had a very rare sensation. Suddenly, the air felt loaded and impossible to breathe, and I felt the annoying feeling that someone was watching me. I looked at the pew that Carmen always occupied, and something told me that she was there, kneeling every day praying, but there was nothing. Alone, that load that could be felt around me, Despite being a priest and having the total certainty of the power and protection of God for his children, he could not help but feel fear, especially when I heard that voice that I knew well, speaking to me and asking me to please give him a little more time to continue with his prayers. I could not turn to the parish house to try to rest, or at least try to make my knees to pray for the rest of the poor girl's soul. I was certain that she was still there inside my parish. I knew that I could not flee from that ghost much time, and that sooner or later I would have to face it, but it was not yet time to gather the value that I needed at that time. I thought about preparing a mass in her name, and I think that was what she wanted, and that is why she had not risen to heaven. I shielded in bed after raising a prayer to heaven so that the soul of poor Carmen could find eternal rest in the Creator's company because, in a certain way, I felt guilty about that tragedy. If I had intervened when she begged me that he would help her to enter the convent, she may now be alive and realize her dream of being a nun. But I wanted her to turn a few more years to be sure of the step she was going to take, and that is why I delayed her transfer so much. Now, everything seemed to indicate that the ghost of the girl intended to stay definitively in the church, and I couldn't do anything about it. After praying a lot, I found a white veil, a veil exactly the same as the one that used Carmen when she came to the church, only that she was stained with blood. I had no doubt. Carmen was wandering in the parish and was even inside the room from the parish house while I slept. How I did not know, but I was fully aware that I would see her very soon and could no longer run away from it. That day was Sunday, and it was time for the Sunday Massachusetts. The ceremony developed as usual with the songs, the praises, and reading of the Holy Word. I did not feel in a position to face the multitude of the parishioners to impart the sermon, so I asked the sacristan to take care of it. All the time I spent there, looking at the crowd, I was sure that somewhere she would be, and then I saw her in the same place as always with her black Bible in her hands. The girl's mother was also all dressed in black because of her mourning and sitting next to her daughter's ghost. I asked her if she knew of that presence in the room. I thought about asking if she could also see her or if it was only me. At the end of the Mass, I tried to do it, but then I did not have the necessary value. The old woman had a demarcated face. She showed that she had cried a lot, and it seemed cruel to touch that matter with her. After greeting her and seeing her cry involuntarily, I saw her leave with a weight on her back that seemed that she loaded the whole universe on her. At night, I asked the sacristan to close the parish before leaving. I did not want to do it because I was afraid to meet Carmen in the living room, and not because I thought I could harm me. The matter was another, rather sentimental. But she had already marked that day for me. It would be that day and not another. I was in the kitchen, had gone through a glass of water to calm my thirst, but I already knew that I could not delay that father conversation. I need to confess something to her. With her angelic face illuminated as Los Angeles are not going to believe me, but when my eyes saw her, the fear she felt, she disappeared completely. We talked a lot. She told me how her death was and asked me to allow her to stay definitively in the parish, and there she is still in the same pew as every day, praying and asking for the helpless. Then I had the total certainty that who had been all those nights in the church had been the ghost of Carmen, whose soul was in sorrow, looking for my approval to let her stay there a little more. For a while later, the residents arrested the landowner, who had hidden in a basement, who had hit him a lot and then handed him over to the police to be tried for the girl's murder. It is said that to date, mainly on the nights of the full moon for those directions, there are those who claim to have seen Carmen passing on the roads, others who have seen her enter the church of the town where even after death comes to pray for all the helpless, and I attest to that. It was a dark night in October when I decided to explore the old abandoned church on the outskirts of town. I had heard chilling tales of this place and, despite the warnings, I embarked on this foolish adventure. The church stood lonely at the end of a forgotten path, hidden between twisted trees and thick weeds. Clouds partially illuminated the building as I felt a chill travel down my back, but I advanced, determined. The doors creaked open with an ominous groan, revealing an interior shrouded in shadow. My flashlight barely managed to cut through the darkness, casting disturbing shadows on the stone walls. The air was impregnated with a smell of moisture and decomposition, and every step resonated in the vacuum, amplifying the sepulchral silence. I explored the central nave, observing the dust-covered benches and clock, symbols of sadness and despair. An ancient organ dominated the corner, its tubes corroded by time but still imposing. The feeling of being observed intensified, and I couldn't help but turn on my heels, hoping to see someone or something stalking in the gloom. Rumors said that the monks who inhabited the church had been massacred during a dark rite, and that their tormented souls still wandered around the place. I remembered the stories from my grandparents of whispering voices and shadows that moved on their own. It was time to investigate the basement, where the most atrocious events had supposedly occurred. I found the hidden basement door after a pile of rubble, closed with a rusty padlock. I managed to force it open with a stone, and the door opened with a crunch, releasing a burst of vitiated air that made me cough. The darkness on the descending stairs was almost palpable, but I took a breath of courage and began to lower each step, creaking under my weight. The walls narrowed around me, giving me a claustrophobic sensation. At the bottom, a long corridor extended in front of me. My flashlight flickered, leaving me in the dark for a moment, but then it stayed on. I walked towards the unknown, my steps resonating in the silence. At the end of the hall, I found an open iron door. I pushed it and entered a large room with walls covered with strange symbols and pentagrams drawn with dried blood. In the center, a stone altar dominated the scene, with human remains dispersed in a macabre chaos. A choked cry escaped my lips when I saw the figure in the opposite corner of the room. It was a man, or what was left of him, with ripped monk clothes and covered with dust. His eyes, sunken in dark basins, stared at me, and a crooked smile formed on his demacrated face. I wanted to run, but my feet felt like lead, nailed to the ground by terror. The monk began moving towards me, its steps echoing with a disturbing echo, whispering unintelligible words like a dark litany that froze my blood. Finally, I regained control of my body and turned to flee. When I arrived at the central nave, the shadows seemed to move around me as if the church itself was alive and eager to catch me. I ran, but everything was futile. The monk's footsteps resonated in my ears, and I felt his bony hands grab my shoulders, despair invading me. I fell to the ground sobbing. The church was alive, feeding on my fear and suffering. I closed my eyes, waiting for the worst, and when I opened them again, I was standing at the cemetery behind the church. The monk had disappeared, and the air was cold and heavy. The moon still shone, but the atmosphere felt loaded with negative energy. I heard whispers from the tombs and saw shadows moving between the tombstones. I decided I had to get out of there before something worse caught me. Dodging the invisible arms that seemed to want to stop me, I finally arrived at the road and did not stop until I got home. My friends laughed when I told them what happened, believing it was just a joke or a product of my imagination. But I knew the truth. The church was haunted, and the souls trapped there would never find rest. The whispers and shadows still chased me, even in my dreams, reminding me that I had invaded a place where the dead did not rest in peace. Over time, I began to notice strange changes in myself. I felt a constant presence, as if the monk had never really left. The whispers became stronger even during the day. Sometimes, I felt a cold wrap around me for no apparent reason. One night, the whispers turned into a chorus. It was as if hundreds of voices spoke in unison, claiming my soul. I got out of bed, unable to endure it anymore, and headed towards the church as if an invisible force pulled me. I pushed open the door, and the inside was even darker than before, but I advanced without hesitation. The whispers guided me, taking me back to the basement. I lowered myself down the stairs and entered the altar hall where the monk awaited me. But this time I was not alone. Ethereal figures filled the room, monks and parishioners from the past, all with looks of pain and despair. The leading monk raised a hand, and the whispers ceased. Suddenly, a sepulchral silence fell upon us. He spoke, his voice an echo of the past, uniting them to wander eternally among the shadows. I wanted to shout, but my voice drowned in my throat. I felt my body become heavy. My members trembled, and I fell to my knees before the altar. The spirits began to surround me, their hands cold and bony, touching me and extracting my energy. My life finally became black, and my last thought was of repentance, wishing not to have been so foolish when challenging the legends. When I woke up, I was no longer myself, trapped in the church as one more spirit among those now condemned. Every night of the full moon, whispers join the choir of the dead, looking for new souls who dare to desecrate the church of the whispers. Thus, the church continues its existence as a place of horror and desolation. Those who venture into its shadows never return, and if they do, the curse is perpetuated, adding to the eternal torment. If you ever hear the whispers at night, close your ears, for the church of the whispers is always hungry, always looking, and it could be your soul the next one to join its eternal choir. My name is Santiago, and I hail from a small rural town in the northern valley known for its coffee. Today, I am a 30-year-old man, but at the time of this tale, I was just 10, living with my mother and stepfather, Raul. I never knew with certainty what business they were involved in, though I always suspected something ugly, possibly smuggling. Every night, at the same time, they forced me to leave the house and head straight to the church, where I had to stay until the mass ended or they sent for me. They justified this by saying that people who did not attend church were looked down upon, especially in the countryside. The family at the masses that the father gave at night had a peculiarity that bothered the congregation. I always fell asleep in the middle of Massachusetts. It was not intentional. Perhaps it was because most of the day I spent it on the street barefoot and without a shirt, running and making natural mischief of my age and my living condition. What happens is that, with the dream product of the hour and the boredom of the sermon, I could not be stronger than me, and that bothered most of the people who were in the place. One night, I arrived late to Massachusetts Father Felligers, upset about my constant faults, decided not to wake me up, and even the priest lent himself to do so. He said that he would call me later to go home because it was time for someone to give me a lesson. I learned that the church was made to praise and exalt the greatness of God and not to come to sleep. When I woke up, I found nobody left in the temple until the lights were already turned off, and absolutely no one remained there, only I. I entered the gloom of that closed darkness and the song of the occasional cricket where the rays are all saying, trying to refresh my vision. When I spent a few minutes and almost groped at the window, I realized what I was going through. It was not yet tomorrow, and that is why I had no choice but to go back to sleep, or at least try to do so. I went to bed about one of the banks and prepared to continue sleeping. I did not know what time it was because I had no clock, but for the height from the moon, I was sure that it was at dawn. I woke up startled with my heart beating 1,000 when I heard a loud noise outside the angry church. I decided to appear again to the street to see who were the ones who made so much noise in the early morning. I was about to leave when, in the distance, I saw them. A group of people coming in the direction of the church, dressed in black robes and carrying black candles with an incandescent light that could be seen from afar. As they came closer, I noticed something odd about this group. They were floating, and their faces showed their evil nature. I knew I couldn't do anything against that army of specters heading towards the temple. I had no choice but to hide, looking for a place in the farthest part of the church where they would be less likely to find me, and closing my eyes, I began to pray so that nothing would happen to me and that ghost procession would not stop in the temple. After several minutes, I decided to open my eyes and look little by little to see if the group of souls had disappeared. When I opened completely, I was in front of another big surprise. The entire group of souls that came in the direction of the church had not only entered but were gathered around me, looking at me with their threatening faces. I could no longer, and terrified, I went to run. I cannot explain how, but the door found her open, and I crossed her as a soul that he took. He could feel his murmurs and his squeaky behind me, and his smell of decomposition corpse was watered by the whole environment. After a while, I no longer felt it, and I arrived at my house with my heart. From that day on, I never fell asleep in the church during the Massachusetts. However, there is a dark side that nobody knows, a secret that I have jealously kept. The truth is that behind my facade of goodness and piety, I practice black magic because from a young age, I felt attracted by the hidden and the forbidden. The restrictions of the church, the rigid rules, and the imposed morality always seemed suffocating. In my years of seminary, I began to explore ancient and grimoires that I found in dusty libraries and secondhand bookstores. At first, it was simple curiosity, but soon I realized the power that you could offer me. Pretending to be a pious man was the perfect mask to hide my true intentions. The trust of the community in me was blind. They came to confess their sins, seeking comfort and guidance without suspecting that I was using their confessions for my own dark ends. One of the most powerful and dangerous rites I performed was the invocation of an ancient demon, seeking more power and knowledge. I prepared the ritual carefully, following the instructions of an ancient grimoire. I drew the circles and necessary symbols on the ground, lit black candles, and recited the arcane words. At first, nothing happened, but then a palpable darkness began to fill the room. I felt a cold and threatening presence. The air became heavy, and a gloomy figure materialized in the center of the circle. An entity of indescribable malevolence. Its power was overwhelming. The demon offered me what I was looking for, power and knowledge beyond what I had imagined. But in return, I had to perform certain acts to strengthen its presence in our world. So I accessed ambition and desire, and since then, my life became an even darker dual existence. During the day, I was a friendly parish priest, but at night, I was a servant of evil, demanding human sacrifices. The first time I took a human life, I felt a mixture of horror and euphoria, knowing that I had crossed a line from which there was no return. But the power I obtained from the inhabitants of the town was immense, mutilated and disfigured, but nobody suspected me. One day, a young woman named Helena arrived at the church, looking for refuge, fleeing from a painful past, and saw in the church a safe place where she could find peace. So I offered help and a place to stay, knowing that soon she would become the next sacrifice. The night before the ritual, I observed her while she slept, feeling a stabbing stab, but the need to fulfill my pact with the demon was greater. The ritual began like all the others, but this time, something went wrong because while reciting the arcane words, Helena woke up and began to shout. Her screams resonated on the walls of the basement, breaking my concentration. The darkness I had invoked became unstable, and the figure of the demon appeared furious about the interruption. I felt his anger as a wave of energy that hit me, and I knew that the demon was in danger and demanded that the ritual be completed. But Helena managed to escape her bonds and ran to the door. I tried, but the room intensified, and the figure of the demon became clearer and more threatening. I felt a terror that I had never experienced before. The demon looked at me with calling eyes and spoke to me directly to the mind, accusing me of having failed and broken the pact. I tried to beg, offering anything to calm his anger, but he knew that the demon had not escaped, and his presence was overwhelmingly felt. His hands, cold and bony, tightened around my neck, and I knew that my destiny was sealed. The demon dragged me to the invocation circle, and I felt as if my soul was being torn from my body. The pain was indescribable, an agony that crossed every fiber of my being. I tried to shout, but I had no voice. The darkness enveloped me, and my vision vanished. I woke up in a world of shadows, trapped in a nightmare. The church was closed, and the disappearances ceased, but the evil that had unleashed continued to stalk. Elena was the only one who knew what had happened, and she became a shadow of her former self, tormented by the knowledge. Every day, I witnessed the suffering of the souls who had sacrificed. Their faces deformed by pain and terror pursued me. Her screams resonated in my mind. I was not redemptible. There was no escape. The demon delighted in my torment, and his macabre laughter resonated in the dark, condemning me to an eternity of suffering. The mask of goodness he had used to deceive others was nothing more than a hoax, and the true nature of evil hides behind the most pious masks. The darkness in the soul, I will never forget the night when I called for help with an exorcism. I am Father Mateo, and I have served in my little parish for more than 20 years. I had faced many evidences of faith, but nothing prepared me for what I would find in that house. The call came to midnight, The bishop woke me up urgently in his voice and asked me to immediately go to a house on the outskirts of the city because the family there needed urgent help. His daughter was possessed, and the priest assigned to the case had suffered a nervous collapse. Without more explanations, I put on my cassock, grabbed my crucifix and Bible, and went out to face the unknown. The house rose lonely at the end of a long, dark street, surrounded by trees that seemed to whisper old secrets. When the atmosphere felt heavy, loaded with a dark energy that made my skin bristle, I knocked on the door and was received by a demacrated man with eyes full of despair, the father of the young woman. He guided me through a narrow hall to a room where other family members were silent, their faces marked by fear and uncertainty. Isabel's girls' room was on the upper floor. I climbed the stairs with my heart racing violently in my chest, every step resonating like a drum in the oppressive silence. When the door opened, a cradle smell of sweat and rot hit me with force. Isabel was tied to the bed with leather straps, her body seniorly, unnaturally. Her eyes, once full of life, were now empty wells of an abysmal black. I approached cautiously, reciting sentences in a low voice. Isabel stared at me, and a crooked smile was drawn on his face. The voice that came out of his mouth was not that of a girl, but a deep and guttural growl that froze my blood. The demon spoke through her, mocking my faith and proclaiming her power over the poor girl. I began the ritual of exorcism, spraying blessed water and reciting passages from the Bible. The demon writhed and screamed, uttering blasphemies and threats. I felt an invisible force trying to stop me, as if an icy hand were squeezing my throat. But my faith did not waver as I continued with the rite, fighting the darkness with each sacred word I uttered. The hours passed as if in a feverish dream. Isabel screamed, and her body convulsed in impossible ways. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and I could see my breath forming clouds in the freezing air. Just when I thought I could not bear it any longer, Isabel let out one last deafening scream and fainted. The heavy atmosphere eased momentarily, and I knew I had won a small victory. Days passed with no signs of Isabel improving. The family was on the verge of collapse, and I myself felt my spirit weakening. Every night, the same nightmare tormented me. Isabel looked at me with those empty eyes, and the voice of the demon echoed in my mind, promising vengeance and destruction. My faith was tested in ways that I had never imagined. One night, while praying in the chapel of the house, I felt a presence behind me. I turned slowly and saw Isabel standing in the doorway, freed from her bonds. Her eyes were now darker than ever, and a malevolent smile deformed her face. Without saying a word, she advanced towards me with slow and sure steps. I recited a quick prayer, raising the crucifix in front of me. But Isabel did not stop, and with a sudden movement, she snatched the crucifix from my hands and threw it to the ground. I felt a wave of panic run through my body, but I did not dare to flee because I knew that I had to face the devil, even if that meant risking my own soul. Isabel stopped a step away, her eyes penetrating mine like knives. I felt an invisible force take over me. Immobilizing the devil began to speak again, but this time in a soft and seductive tone. He whispered dark secrets and forbidden truths, tempting my faith with promises of power and knowledge. I resisted with all my strength, mentally reciting the Psalms and clinging to my faith as if it were a weapon, a life preserver in a sea of despair. The spiritual battle that was taking place within me was exhausting, and I felt my strength faltering. And just when I was about to give up, a warm light filled the room. I felt a divine presence that enveloped me, giving me the courage and strength that I needed. With renewed determination, I pronounced the last verse of the exorcism ritual. Isabel let out a heart-rending scream and fell to the floor, her body inert. The dark presence vanished, leaving the room in a deathly silence. I knelt before Isabel, praying for her soul and thanking God for his intervention. The following days were a mixture of hope and fear. Isabel seemed to be recovering, though slowly. Her eyes had regained some of their sparkle, and her parents began to believe that the worst was over. But deep in my heart, something told me that the battle was not over yet. One night, as I watched Isabel sleep, I heard a faint whisper, and I thought it was my imagination. But the whispers intensified, filling the room with a chorus of dark voices. Isabel suddenly woke up, her eyes empty again, and her face deformed by an evil smile. The demon was not gone. He had only been waiting, gathering strength. Isabel's figure rose from the bed and began to float in the air, her body contorted. I felt a primal terror take hold of me, but I could not let the demon win. So I grabbed my Bible and began to recite the most powerful prayers I knew, while Isabel screamed and laughed in a voice that echoed throughout the house. The demon spoke through Isabel, revealing dark and disturbing secrets about my own life, things that only a supernatural being could know. My faith was put to the brutal test, and I felt my mind fracture under the pressure. But I continued, knowing that Isabel's salvation depended on my resistance. The fight lasted all night, and just before dawn, the demon let out a last scream and left Isabel's body, leaving a black cloud that dissipated into the air. Isabel fell to the ground, unconscious but alive. The family gathered around her, crying with relief and gratitude, and I thought that we had finally won. But that same night, I was tormented by dark dreams and visions of horror. I woke up sweating and with the feeling of being watched. When I got up, I found claw marks on the walls of my room as if an infernal creature had been prowling while I slept. And each night since then, the dark presence grew stronger. I knew that the demon was not really gone. It was lurking, waiting for the right moment to claim its revenge. Isabel began to show signs of relapse, her eyes clouding over again, and her behavior becoming erratic. The desperate family asked me for help again, but this time, I felt that I was alone in the battle. One night, as I recited prayers in my room, I felt an icy cold around me. The candles went out suddenly, and darkness enveloped me. I heard the demon's laughter echoing in my ears, and a shadowy figure appeared in front of me. It was Isabel, or rather, the demon that had possessed her. The demon spoke, his voice echoing in my mind and my soul, telling me that I had lost, that my faith was not enough to defeat him. I felt a deep despair, but I refused to give up. I raised my crucifix, but the demon shattered it with a simple gesture. In a last desperate attempt, I began to recite the Lord's Prayer, but the demon came closer, and I felt his cold breath on my face. Just when I thought all was lost, a falling light filled the room. I felt a warm hand on my shoulder, and I knew I was not alone. The demon screamed in pain and fury and finally disappeared in a burst of shadows. I fell to my knees, exhausted but victorious. The chapel was silent. The dark presence was gone. I felt a deep peace, a certainty that I had triumphed over the darkness. But I knew that the battle had left permanent marks. My faith was stronger than ever, but it was also tinged by the shadow of the darkness that I had faced. And from that night, I continued my work in the parish with a new perspective. I knew that evil lurked in the shadows, always waiting for an opportunity, but I also knew that the light of faith could triumph over any darkness. And so I lived with the certainty that although the battle had been hard, the victory of light over darkness was always possible.